The cry came from a place where no child should have been. It echoed across the empty prairie like a ghost calling from beneath the earth, sharp and broken, cutting through the wind that swept over a forgotten town near the county line. The sheriff heard it just as the sun began its descent behind a canyon ridge, painting the dust trails in shades of blood and amber. He had ridden 3 days to reach this settlement, a place so remote that even the rail depot had been abandoned years ago. But that sound, that desperate wail of a young girl, stopped him cold in his saddle. Something terrible had happened here, something the frontier wanted to keep buried. If this story touches something in you, show your support with a like and join us by subscribing, because justice always finds its way to those who listen. The town sat at the edge of nowhere, where the homesteads gave way to endless dust, and the only law was what men decided it would be. The sheriff had been summoned by a telegram so brief it felt like a whisper, just 3 words. Come, child, urgent. He had arrived to find windows shuttered, doors closed, and faces that turned away when he rode down the main street past the saloon. The girl stood alone near the old livery stable, no older than 10. Her dress torn and covered in dried mud that looked like it had been there for days. Her eyes were wide but empty, like she had seen something that stole the light from them. When she saw the sheriff, she didn't run toward him. She simply pointed toward the abandoned ranch at the town's western edge, where the longhorn cattle used to graze before the drought took everything. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with sound that seemed too loud in the unnatural quiet. The girl didn't speak, but her trembling finger remained extended, aimed at the horizon where broken fences and collapsed barns marked the ghost of prosperity. He knelt before her, his shadow falling across her small frame, and he saw the bruises on her wrists, faint but unmistakable. Someone had held her. Someone had hurt her. And this entire town, every single soul behind those closed doors, knew exactly what had happened. The sheriff felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the burden of being the only one willing to see what others chose to ignore. He stood and placed his hand gently on the girl's shoulder, feeling her flinch before she allowed the touch. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of old leather and rotting wood from the abandoned structures beyond. Somewhere in this forgotten corner of the West, a crime had been committed, and the silence surrounding it was louder than any gunshot. The sheriff had learned long ago that the worst evils didn't announce themselves with violence and chaos. They hid in plain sight, protected by fear and complicity, growing stronger with every moment people pretended not to notice. This girl had cried out, and he had heard her. That made him responsible. As the sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the empty street, the sheriff began to understand why he had been called here, not by the townspeople, who clearly wanted no part of this, but by something deeper, something that demanded witnesses when injustice took root. The girl finally lowered her hand, and in that gesture, the sheriff saw surrender mixed with the faintest flicker of hope. She had been alone with whatever darkness lived here, carrying a secret that was crushing her small body. He had arrived at the edge of the forgotten West, where civilization's rules dissolved into dust, and a child's cry had just unlocked something that should have remained buried. The sheriff turned his gaze toward the abandoned ranch, and in the failing light, he could see movement, shadows shifting where no one should be. The girl grabbed the edge of his coat, her fingers clutching the fabric with surprising strength. She still hadn't spoken, but he understood. Whatever waited out there in that place of forgotten dreams and broken promises, it was connected to her, bound to her suffering in ways he would need to uncover. The frontier had always been a place where people ran to escape their past, but it was also where the past had a way of catching up, of demanding payment for sins left unpaid. He made a decision in that moment, standing in the dying light with a traumatized child holding on to him like he was the last solid thing in a world gone to quicksand. He would not leave this town until he knew the truth. He would not mount his horse and ride away while this girl carried the weight of whatever horror had been inflicted upon her. The cry that had stopped him on the prairie had been more than a sound. It had been a summons, a call to the only kind of justice that mattered in places like this, The kind that came not from courts and laws, but from one person deciding that some things could not be allowed to stand. The forgotten West had just remembered what it meant to have a sheriff who refused to look away. The sheriff led the girl toward the boarding house, the only place in town that still showed signs of life beyond the saloon's muted murmur. Every step they took together drew eyes from behind curtains, faces appearing and disappearing like nervous animals checking for predators. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, a mixture of fear and guilt that hung over the settlement like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. The woman who ran the boarding house opened the door only wide enough to see who stood on her porch, and when her eyes landed on the girl, something between recognition and terror flashed across her features. She let them in without a word, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke volumes about the silence this town had agreed to maintain. Inside, the boarding house smelled of old coffee and desperation, the kind of place where people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. The sheriff sat the girl down in a chair near the cold fireplace, while the woman brought water and a clean cloth. As she gently cleaned the dirt from the girl's face, the sheriff watched the woman's hands shake, noticed how she avoided looking directly at the child's eyes. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The woman's hands stopped moving for just a moment before continuing their work. 3 days, she whispered. 3 days since she showed up at the edge of town, walking out of the prairie like a spirit. The sheriff felt anger beginning to build in his gut, a slow burn that he had learned to control but never fully extinguish. He stepped outside onto the porch and surveyed the town as darkness settled over it like a shroud. The saloon across the street glowed with lamplight, and through its dusty windows, he could see men gathered, their voices rising and falling in conversation that stopped abruptly whenever someone glanced toward the boarding house. They knew he was here. They knew why he was here, and their continued silence told him everything about the nature of this place. In the frontier towns, justice was often a negotiable concept, something that bent and twisted depending on who held the power and who held the fear. But the sheriff had not ridden 3 days to negotiate. He had come because a child had cried out, and in his experience, when children cried in towns like this, it meant adults had failed in the most fundamental way possible. A man emerged from the saloon, older than most, his gait suggesting authority or at least a memory of it. He approached the boarding house with measured steps, stopping at the base of the porch stairs. "Sheriff," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Name's Crawford. I run what's left of this town, such as it is." The sheriff didn't move from his position, didn't offer his hand, just waited. Crawford shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "The girl, she's been through something, we all know that. But sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. If you understand my meaning." The sheriff understood perfectly. This was the first attempt to make him go away, to convince him that whatever had happened was none of his concern, that the frontier had its own way of handling things. "Where did she come from?" the sheriff asked, ignoring Crawford's suggestion entirely. The older man looked back at the saloon, as if seeking support or permission, before answering. "The Blackwell place. Old ranch about 2 miles west. Been abandoned since the family moved on, or so we thought." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's a man been staying out there, keeps to himself mostly, comes into town for supplies, maybe once a month. We don't ask questions. He don't offer answers. That's how things work here." The sheriff felt the pieces beginning to form a picture, still unclear but taking shape. "And the girl," Crawford's jaw tightened, "ain't nobody's child from around here. We figured she was his kin or maybe a ward. Not our business to pry into a man's private affairs." The sheriff descended the porch steps until he stood level with Crawford, close enough to see the fear behind the man's weathered facade. A child shows up traumatized and alone, and it took 3 days for anyone to send for help. 3 days she wandered this town while you all decided it wasn't your business. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of judgment. Crawford's face reddened, anger mixing with shame. "You don't understand how things work out here, Sheriff. We survive by minding our own affairs. The Blackwell place. Whatever happens out there, it's beyond the county line, technically. Not even in your jurisdiction. The sheriff smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I stopped caring about lines on maps a long time ago. The only line that matters is the one between right and wrong, and that girl in there, she's on the right side of it. Crawford stepped back, recognizing that persuasion had failed. You go out to that ranch, you might not like what you find, and you definitely won't like what finds you. It was meant as a warning, perhaps even a threat, but it only confirmed what the sheriff had already suspected. This town wasn't just complicit through inaction. They were actively protecting whatever darkness lived at the abandoned ranch. The pain in the girl's eyes suddenly made terrible sense. She hadn't just been hurt by one person. She had been failed by dozens, by an entire community that had chosen comfort over conscience. As Crawford retreated back to the saloon, the sheriff returned to the boarding house, where the girl now sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes following his every movement with an intensity that broke his heart. She still hadn't spoken a single word, but she didn't need to. Her silence screamed louder than any testimony, and the sheriff had heard enough to know exactly what he needed to do next. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt more like an ending than a beginning. The sheriff prepared his horse while the girl watched from the boarding house window, her small face pressed against the glass like she was memorizing his features in case he didn't return. The woman who ran the boarding house had tried to get the girl to eat, to speak, to show any sign of the child she must have been before 3 days ago, but the trauma had locked her in a prison of silence. The sheriff checked his rifle, not because he expected to use it, but because the weight of it reminded him of the responsibility he carried. As he mounted his horse, he saw Crawford and 2 other men emerge in the saloon, their faces etched with concern that had nothing to do with the girl's welfare and everything to do with what the sheriff might uncover at the Blackwell place. The ride to the abandoned ranch took less than an hour, following a dust trail that wound through scrubland and past the skeleton remains of what had once been a thriving cattle operation. The longhorn herds were long gone, sold off or dead from the drought that had broken this part of the frontier. The main house stood against the morning sky like a rotting tooth, its paint peeled away by wind and sun, its windows dark and watching. But it was the barn that drew the sheriff's attention, a massive structure that somehow seemed more intact than the house, its doors closed tight with new chains and padlocks that gleamed in the weak sunlight. New locks on an abandoned property. The sheriff dismounted and approached slowly, every sense alert, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, not from fear, but from readiness. The silence around the ranch was profound, unnatural even for a place this isolated. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, as if nature itself had decided to avoid whatever evil had taken root here. The sheriff circled the barn, noting the fresh boot prints in the dust, the discarded tin cans near the back entrance, the signs of recent habitation. Someone was living here, or had been until very recently. When he returned to the front, he noticed something he had missed on his first pass. Small handprints on the barn door, positioned low, at a child's height, pressed against the wood like she had been trying to push her way out or perhaps prevent herself from being pushed in. The sheriff felt his stomach turn, the implications of those handprints hitting him with physical force. He drew his pistol and used the butt to break the lock, the metal giving way with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty prairie. The barn door swung open slowly, and the smell that emerged made the sheriff step back involuntarily. It wasn't death, not exactly, but it was a smell of suffering, of human misery concentrated in a confined space. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, he saw what the town had been protecting through their silence. Chains hanging from support beams, a small cot in the corner, stained and torn, drawings on the wall, crude figures made with charcoal or dirt, depicting scenes that no child should have to illustrate. And in the far corner, a trunk that the sheriff approached with a growing sense of dread. Inside the trunk, he found the evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Photographs, dozens of them, showing the girl in various states of distress, her face capturing progression from fear to resignation to the empty-eyed numbness he had seen yesterday. Documents indicating she had been purchased, actually purchased like property, from a corrupt orphanage back east, letters detailing the man's intentions, his belief that out here beyond the law's reach, he could do as he pleased with a child no one would miss. The sheriff's hand shook as he read, not from fear but from a rage so pure it felt like fire in his veins. This wasn't just abuse. This was systematic, premeditated evil, and it had been allowed to continue because a town decided their peace was more valuable than a child suffering. He gathered the evidence carefully, his mind already working through what came next. The man who had done this wasn't here, had likely fled when the girl escaped. But the sheriff knew he wouldn't have gone far. Men like this, they always believed they were untouchable, that the frontier's vastness would swallow their crimes. The drawings on the wall told a story more complete than any testimony could. They showed the girl's imprisonment, her daily torment, and in the final drawings, something else, her escape. She had drawn herself running toward lights in the distance, toward the town that would ultimately fail her by its inaction. But she had also drawn one more figure, arriving late to the scene, a man on horseback. She had drawn the sheriff before he even arrived, as if her hope alone had summoned him. The sheriff emerged from the barn into the harsh daylight, the evidence secured in his saddlebag, his purpose crystallized into absolute clarity. The girl had survived something that would have destroyed most adults, and she had done alone, with nothing but the will to keep breathing and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would care enough to act. He mounted his horse and turned back toward town, but this time he wasn't returned to ask questions or gather information. He was returned to deliver justice, the kind that didn't wait for courts or judges, the kind that the forgotten West sometimes required when civilization's institutions failed to reach those who needed them most. The ranch of broken souls had given up its secrets, and now it was time for the town to face what their silence had protected. The sheriff rode back into town at midday, the sun directly overhead casting short shadows that made every figure on the street look smaller, less substantial. Crawford and his men were waiting, positioned strategically near the saloon, their hands resting on gun belts in a display meant to intimidate. But the sheriff had seen too much in that barn to be intimidated by small men playing at power. He dismounted in the center of the street, his movements deliberate, and pulled the trunk of evidence from his horse, setting it down in the dust where everyone could see. The boarding house door opened, and the woman stepped out with the girl, who had requested through gestures to be present for whatever came next. The sheriff had tried to dissuade her, but the determination in her eyes reminded him that survival required witnesses, and she had earned the right to see this through. The man who lived at the Blackwell place. The sheriff's voice carried across the silent street. "Where is he?" Crawford shifted nervously, his companions exchanging glances that confirmed they knew exactly who and where. "He left town 3 days ago, right after the girl ran. We haven't seen him since." The sheriff opened the trunk, pulling out photographs and letters, holding them up for all to see. Windows that had been shuttered began to open, faces appearing as the town's curiosity overcame its desire to remain uninvolved. This girl was bought and imprisoned, tortured for months while you all went about your business. And when she finally escaped, you did nothing until someone forced you to acknowledge her existence. His words fell like hammer blows, each one landing with the weight of moral judgment. A woman emerged from one of the houses, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't know," she cried, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The sheriff turned to face her, his expression hard, but not without compassion for how people convince themselves to ignore evil. "You knew something was wrong. You all did. But knowing required action, and action required courage. And courage is something this town ran out of long before the water did." He turned back to Crawford. The man's name. Now. Crawford's resistance finally crumbled under the combined weight of exposure and shame. Blackwell. Marcus Blackwell. He's the one who owned the ranch originally. Came back 6 months ago with a girl. Said she was his niece. We had our suspicions, but you did nothing. The sheriff finished for him. He knelt beside the girl, who had moved closer during the confrontation, her presence a silent accusation more powerful than any words. This child walked into your town begging for help through her very existence, and you turned away, every single one of you." He stood again, his hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. "Blackwell hasn't left the area. Men like him, they're too arrogant to run far. They believe the frontier protects them. That distance equals immunity." He scanned the gathered crowd, seeing the guilt and shame beginning to register on faces. He's watching this town right now, waiting to see if you'll let him come back, if your silence will hold one more time. As if summoned by the sheriff's words, a figure appeared at the far end of the street, standing at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. Marcus Blackwell stood there with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond reach, his posture radiating the kind of arrogance that came from getting away with evil for too long. He was younger than the sheriff expected, perhaps 40, well-dressed for the frontier, carrying himself like a gentleman despite the monstrous nature revealed in the trunk's contents. The girl saw him and immediately pressed closer to the sheriff, her body trembling but her eyes locked on the man who had stolen her childhood. The town collectively held its breath, waiting to see how this would resolve, whether the frontier's old ways of silence and complicity would win, or if something new might emerge from this confrontation. The sheriff handed his badge to the boarding house woman, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Hold this for a moment," he said quietly, by removing the symbol of his office. He was stepping outside the law's framework, acknowledging that what came next existed in that gray space where justice and vengeance merged into something the courts couldn't name, but the frontier understood perfectly. He walked toward Blackwell slowly, deliberately, giving the man every opportunity to speak, to run, to make any choice other than standing there with that smirk on his face. "You should have kept riding," the sheriff called out when he was close enough to be heard clearly. Blackwell laughed, actually laughed, the sound carrying back to the watching town. "And miss the entertainment? You think these people will stand with you? They've been taking my money for months, Sheriff. Every one of them." The revelation hung in the air like gun smoke, and the sheriff saw the truth of it in the way people's eyes dropped, unable to meet his gaze. Blackwell had bought the town's silence with coin, making them complicit through payment rather than just fear. It was a deeper corruption than the sheriff had imagined, one that made the girl's suffering not just ignored, but financially incentivized. He turned back to look at her, standing now in the middle of the street, small and traumatized, but still standing, and he made a decision that had been building since he first heard her cry across the prairie. "The law says you deserve a trial," he said to Blackwell, loud enough for everyone to hear. But the law couldn't reach this girl when she needed it most. The law took money to look the other way. So today, we're going to let something older than law decide what happens next. The sheriff's challenge was clear, and Blackwell's smirk faltered as he realized the frontier's rules were about to be applied without the cushion of his money or the town's complicity. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the street in amber light, and the stage was set for a reckoning that had been delayed by 3 days of cowardice, but would now be delivered with the absolute certainty that came when someone finally decided that some lines could not be crossed without consequence. The forgotten West was about to remember what it meant when justice arrived too late, to prevent suffering, but just in time to ensure it would never happen again. The girl watched in the street center, surrounded by the very people who had failed her, about to witness whether one man's courage could redeem an entire town's shame. What happened next would be told and retold across the frontier for years to come, but those who would always remember it with a mixture of pride and shame. The sheriff didn't draw his gun, didn't resort to the violence that men like Blackwell understood and expected. Instead, he picked up the trunk of evidence and walked it to the center of the street, opening it fully so that every photograph, every letter, every piece of documentation was visible to the assembled town. "This is who you protected," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "This is what your silence bought." He turned to Blackwell, who had begun to realize that his money wouldn't save him this time. "You can run now. You can take your horse and ride out of this county, and I'll give you until sundown to cross the border. But if you ever come back, if I ever hear your name again in connection with a child, I'll hunt you across every territory until one of us is dead." Blackwell's face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You're letting me go? After everything?" The sheriff's expression remained cold and hard as granite. "I'm not letting you go. I'm showing this town what their silence costs. Because you're going to leave here marked Blackwell. Everyone who sees you will know what you are." He gestured to the boarding house woman, who emerged with a pot of something dark and steaming. It was pine tar, the kind used to mark cattle, permanent and unmistakable. "Hold him," the sheriff commanded, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then Crawford stepped forward, followed by two others, their faces showing the first signs of what might eventually become redemption. They grabbed Blackwell, who struggled and cursed, but the fight had gone out of him when he realized the sheriff wasn't going to give him the clean ending of a bullet. The sheriff took a brush and painted a large X across Blackwell's forehead, the tar burning and staining a mark that would take months to fade. "Now everyone who sees you will know to keep their children away. Every town you pass through, every saloon you enter, they'll ask about that mark, and you'll have to tell them, or live with their suspicion." He stepped back, and Blackwell was released, stumbling backward with his hands pressed to his branded face. "Sundown," the sheriff repeated. "And if you're still in this county after that, I'll consider it an invitation to finish this a different way." Blackwell mounted his horse without another word, his humiliation complete, and rode out of town at a gallop, heading for the county line and whatever exile awaited him beyond. The sheriff turned to the assembled townspeople, his expression showing no satisfaction in what had just transpired. "You all have a choice now. You can go back to your lives pretending this never happened, or you could be better than you were 3 days ago." He walked to where the girl stood, still silent but with something new in her eyes, something that might eventually become trust again. This child is going to need a home, real care, people who protect her instead of looking away. Can this town provide that? Or do I need to take her somewhere that deserves her? The woman from the boarding house stepped forward first, her decision made. She can stay with me. I have room and I have time, and I owe her at least that much for my silence. Others began to nod, agreeing, their shame transforming slowly into purpose. Crawford approached the sheriff with the badge still in his hand, offering it back. "What you did today, that wasn't law. That was something else." The sheriff took the badge and pinned it back on his chest. That was justice. Not the kind written in books or decided in courtrooms, but the kind that happens when people finally decide that evil doesn't get to win just because it's convenient to look away. He paused, his voice softening slightly. "The law is what we make it out here. Today, we made it mean something for a child who had no one else." Crawford nodded, understanding that the sheriff had given them all something more valuable than punishment for their complicity. He had given them a chance to be better, to transform their shame into action. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of purple and gold, the girl finally spoke her first word since arriving in town. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only the sheriff heard. 2 words that carried the weight of unspeakable trauma, beginning its long journey toward healing. He knelt before her, his eyes meeting hers with gentleness that contradicted his weathered features. "You saved yourself," he told her. "You were brave enough to run, brave enough to keep living when giving up would have been easier. I just showed up at the end." She shook her head slightly, and in that gesture, he saw that she understood what he had really done. He had made her suffering matter. He had forced the town to see her, to acknowledge her, to take responsibility for what their silence had enabled. The sheriff prepared to leave as darkness settled over frontier town. But before mounting his horse, he addressed the gathered crowd one final time. "The forgotten West only stays forgotten if we choose to forget. But this girl, she's going to remember. She's going to remember who helped and who didn't, who stepped forward and who stayed hidden. And years from now, when she's grown and strong, she'll be the memory that keeps this town honest." He swung into his saddle, the leather creaking in the quiet evening air. "I'll be checking back. Not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually, And when I do, this town better become the kind of place that deserves her. With that, he turned his horse toward the county line, riding away from the settlement as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The townspeople stood in the street long after the sheriff had disappeared into the purple twilight, each of them processing what had happened and what it meant for who they would be going forward. The girl remained in the boarding house doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching the horizon where the sheriff had vanished. She had learned something profound in those terrible months of captivity and the 3 days of silent suffering afterward. That evil thrived in silence and comfort, but justice required someone brave enough to make noise in the darkness. The frontier had always been a place where people ran to escape their past, but today it becomes something else, a place where one girl's cry had unlocked a buried truth and forced an entire community to choose between complicity and courage. And in the end, when given the chance, they had chosen to try to be better. In the forgotten West, where the prairie stretched endlessly and the law existed only when someone was brave enough to enforce it, that was as close to redemption as anyone could hope for.